The blizzard raged as Elias finally reached his abandoned cabin. But thin smoke rose. Inside, a desperate woman clutched two newborns. "This cannot be happening," he roared silently. He saw a lost detail in their tiny faces. His past haunted him. Now, faced with saving them, he must decide: abandon them to the storm or risk his broken heart again. His journey was a testament to his broken spirit, a long, arduous march away from everything that had once anchored him. Each upward step was a deliberate severing of ties, a brutal negotiation with the wilderness for a peace that only absolute solitude could offer. He carried the weight of his tools, his rifle, and meager provisions. But the heaviest burden was the sorrow that clung to him like a shroud of deep winter snow. The world below, with its bustling towns and hurried lives, held no solace, only echoes of laughter and the ghosts of embraces that would never return. He had been a man of the earth, a builder, a provider, his hands strong and his spirit firm. But the earth had taken what he cherished, leaving him hollow, a shell driven by a singular, desperate need for oblivion. The mountains had always called to him, not with a gentle whisper, but with a primal roar of challenge and unyielding beauty. Now they offered a different kind of solace, a raw, indifferent canvas onto which he could project his desolation without judgment. The crisp, clean air filled his lungs, cutting through the haze of grief, offering a clarity that was both sharp and cruel. Pine needles crunched under his heavy boots, the scent a balm to his scarred senses. He remembered teaching his boy the names of the trees, the tracks of deer in the snow, the bite of the wind that could carve mountains into art. These memories, once a source of joy, were now shards of glass in his mind, cutting at every turn. Yet, he pressed on, driven by a stubborn will to outrun the pain that clung to his very soul. He sought not to mend, but to seal himself off, to become as unyielding and forgotten as the ancient stones around him. He had pictured it many times, the cabin he sought, a skeletal frame of logs choked by snow and silence, its hearth cold, its windows empty eyes staring out at the indifferent expanse. It would be a stark sanctuary, a tomb for his remaining years, where no one would ever seek him, and no new loss could ever find him. He had chosen it for its remoteness, a place whispered about in hushed tones by trappers who dared not venture so high, a place where civilization's reach ended abruptly. It was perfect for a man who wished to simply cease existing, leaving no trace but the fading imprint of his broken heart. The early winter snow whipped at his face, a stinging reminder of the mountain's harsh embrace, as he finally glimpsed the precarious structure. A sigh, heavy with the weight of his journey and his soul, escaped him. This was it, his final refuge. But as his eyes narrowed against the swirling flakes, a flicker of something utterly out of place caught his attention. It was a thin, desperate column of smoke, barely visible against the gray canvas of the sky, rising from the stone chimney. A tremor of unease, sharp and unwelcome, snaked through him. This cabin was meant to be abandoned, a ghost of its former self, not a beacon of unexpected life. His hand instinctively went to the cold steel of his rifle. His solitude threatened, his carefully constructed plan of isolation suddenly in jeopardy. The mountain, it seemed, had a different destiny in mind, one that would shatter the fragile peace he had so desperately sought. The thin wisp of smoke, a defiant plume against the vast indifference of the mountain, pulled Elias forward with an unsettling mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. Each heavy bootfall in the deepening snow felt louder, more intrusive, as he approached the cabin. The silence of the wilderness, usually a balm, now felt watchful, charged with an unspoken question. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but a different kind of chill settled in his gut, the premonition of an end or perhaps a beginning he was not ready for. The scent of wood smoke, faint at first, grew stronger, mingling with the crisp, clean air, and beneath it, a subtle, almost imperceptible human scent. Wood, ash, and something else, something vulnerable and alive. His hand tightened on his rifle. Familiar weight against his numb fingers, a desperate comfort against the unknown that lay ahead. He moved cautiously, a shadow among the ancient pines, his years of hunting and solitude honing his senses to a razor's edge. The cabin, a ramshackle structure of rough-hewn logs, sagged under the weight of time and snow. Its single window, barely more than a gap covered by animal hide, offered no glimpse within. He paused at the door, a crude affair of thick planks, listening. There was no sound save for the wind whistling through the gaps in the logs, and the distant mournful call of a lone owl. Yet the smoke was undeniable, a testament to a presence. He raised a hand, his knuckles brushing against the rough wood, hesitant. This was the threshold not just to a dwelling, but to a truth he had climbed so high to avoid. With a deep, shuddering breath, he pushed the door inward. The interior was a world apart from the biting cold outside. A fragile, flickering warmth emanated from a small, struggling fire in a stone hearth. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, unwashed clothes, and a faint, sweet tang he could not immediately place. His eyes, accustomed to the stark light of the snow, struggled to adjust to the dimness. Then he saw her, huddled beside the embers, a woman, thin and gaunt, her face streaked with dirt and despair. Her eyes, wide and hollowed by terror and exhaustion, met his gaze, holding a silent plea that resonated with a primal depth. And in her arms, bundled in tattered cloths, lay not one, but two impossibly small forms, twins, newborns fragile against the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them all. The cabin, which he had envisioned as his grave of memories, had transformed into a precarious nursery on the brink of death. Elias stood frozen, a dark silhouette framed against the swirling snow, his mind reeling. A silent fury, cold and bitter, rose within him. Fate, it seemed, was a cruel jester, presenting him with the very specter of what he had lost. He had sought the desolate wild for its emptiness, and instead he had stumbled upon life in its most vulnerable, most demanding form. He could read the story etched in the woman's haunted eyes, hear it in the silent language of her desperation. Magda, he knew her name without being told, was a refugee, just as he was. She fled from a town that had condemned her, from a man whose cruel mark was still faintly visible beneath the scarf she clutched to her face. She had sought these mountains to die, yet her children, fiercely, impossibly, clung to life. For an agonizing moment, the mountain man remained at the threshold, the wind howling its ancient lament around him. A faint, almost imperceptible cry escaped one of the infants, a pathetic sound swallowed almost immediately by the immensity of the natural world. But to Elias, it was a sound that shattered the stone around his heart, a sound that haunted his own dreams. It was the echo of a life he had failed to protect, a future that had been brutally stolen. In that cry, he saw the unbearable reflection of his own lost family, a mirror held up to his deepest wounds. To turn his back on them now would be to bury his wife and son a second time, to abandon them to the same merciless indifference that had claimed his own. The mountain, he realized with a stark cold clarity, would take no more. His decision, though born of a profound reluctance, was made with the quiet inevitability of a glacier's slow advance. Without a word, he stepped inside, closing the heavy door against the swirling tempest outside. The faint sound of its latch clicking into place was a declaration, an irreversible turning of the page. He let his pack of furs and dried provisions slide to the floor, the thud, a punctuation mark in the heavy silence. His gaze lingered on the woman, then on the two fragile bundles in her arms, before he moved with a deliberate slowness. He picked up his axe, its polished head gleaming faintly in the firelight, and turned back towards the door. The chill outside was unforgiving, the night long, but the need for warmth, for shelter, for sustenance was now undeniable. He stepped out into the swirling snow, the rhythmic thwack of wood being split against a chopping block, soon becoming the sole, desperate promise that the encroaching darkness and the bitter cold of this unexpected new life would somehow, impossibly, be overcome. The rhythm of the axe, sharp and relentless against the frozen wood, became the pulse of the night. Each blow echoed through the desolate valley, a stark declaration of defiance against the encroaching winter. Elias worked with a grim determination, his muscles protesting the cold, but his mind focused solely on the task at hand. The woodpile grew, a small victory against the vast indifference of the mountain. He was not chopping just for warmth, but for purpose, for a fragile thread of existence he had inadvertently inherited. The woman, Magda, remained huddled by the fire, her silent presence a constant, unsettling reminder of his shattered solitude. He felt her eyes on him, a silent plea, a desperate hope he was ill-equipped to answer. When he finally re-entered the cabin, his arms laden with fresh firewood, the air inside felt heavier, charged with unspoken questions. He dropped the logs by the hearth, the sound loud in the small space, and the two infants stirred, letting out soft, reedy sounds. Magda flinched, pulling them closer, her gaze still fixed on him, wary and exhausted. She was a creature cornered, seeking refuge, and he, the reluctant keeper of a forgotten sanctuary. The cabin, once his haven from human connection, was now a crucible for it. He saw the lines of starvation etched on her face, the raw fear in her eyes, and a flicker of something ancient, something protective, stirred within him. Despite his hardened heart, he moved about the cramped space with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. He stirred the embers, coaxing them back to life, the flames licking at the fresh wood, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He took stock of his provisions, dried venison, hardtack, a small pouch of ground coffee. Not much, but enough for one. Now, it had to be enough for 4. He poured water into a blackened pot, setting it over the fire, the metallic scrape of the kettle against the stone echoing the tension in the room. He did not speak. Words to him were brittle things, easily broken, just like promises. His actions, stark and unadorned, were his only language. Magda watched him, a silent study. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his strong frame, the almost animalistic grace of his movements. He was a man forged by hardship, a creature of the wild. But beneath the layers of stoic silence, she sensed a flicker of something else, something that had held him back from simply closing the door on her and her vulnerable cargo. Her own story was one of betrayal and flight, of hurried steps through the unforgiving snow, of hunger and cold gnawing at her spirit. The town she'd fled had offered only scorn and condemnation for her unwanted children, labeling her a sinner, an outcast. She had sought the mountains as a final, desperate act, believing they would offer a swift, merciful end. Instead, they had led her to this cabin and this strange, silent man. As the water began to boil, steam rising in a thin plume, Elias finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse, cutting through the silence like the crack of ice. He offered no welcome, no comfort, only a stark pronouncement, a condition for their shared survival. He would allow them to stay for now in this remote haven that was once meant for him alone. But the mountain demanded a price for sanctuary, and so would he. His words were not a negotiation, but a decree etched in the raw necessity of their situation. He would hunt, he would protect, he would provide. But she too would contribute. This was not charity, but a partnership born of desperation, a silent contract between two outcasts clinging to the precipice of existence. He made it clear that comfort was a luxury the mountain rarely afforded. Yet, in his harsh terms, she found a strange, unexpected flicker of hope. He offered not softness but a sanctuary, a chance to carve out a fragile home in exchange for usefulness, and an unyielding respect for the harsh, unbending rules of that savage place. The days that followed blurred into a harsh routine, dictated by the unforgiving rhythm of the mountain winter. Elias hunted with relentless precision, his traps laid with cunning, his rifle a silent extension of his will. He taught Magda how to prepare the game, how to cure the meat and stretch the hides, his instructions terse and to the point. She learned quickly, driven by a primal need to provide for her children, her movements growing more confident, less hesitant. The cabin, once a place of stark survival, slowly began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a fragile, burgeoning home. The scent of pine resin and wood smoke mingled with the sweet, milky smell of the infants, an unusual blend in the isolated dwelling. Magda, for her part, brought an unexpected warmth to the otherwise desolate space. While Elias labored outside, battling the elements, she turned her attention to the small domestic tasks that transformed the bare cabin. She mended worn clothing with careful stitches, her fingers deft with needle and thread, a skill she had learned in a life far removed from this wild existence. She brewed herbal teas from dried mountain plants, soothing the infant's cries and even easing Elias's own aches after long days in the snow. Her touch was gentle, her presence quiet, but her influence was a subtle current, slowly eroding the icy shell around the mountain man's heart. He would return from the hunt to find the cabin warmer, the air cleaner, and a simmering pot of stew on the hearth, its aroma a welcome change from the bitter cold. He watched her, often from the shadowed corners of the cabin, or through the small, hide-covered window as she gathered kindling. He saw her competence, her quiet strength, and her unwavering devotion to her twins. It was not the physical prowess of a mountain woman, but a deeper, more profound resilience. Her knowledge of herbs, her ability to make a coarse fabric feel almost soft, her quiet songs to the babies, these were the unexpected gifts she brought to his isolated world. She took his crude, solitary dwelling, a place of mere survival, and began to infuse it with the subtle, undeniable essence of a home. She created order out of chaos, warmth out of cold, transforming a hunter's refuge into a space where life, against all odds, could not only endure, but perhaps even flourish. One particularly brutal morning, as a blizzard raged outside, threatening to bury the cabin under drifts of snow, a cry of alarm erupted from Magda. One of the twins, already weakened by the harsh conditions, had fallen dangerously ill. Its breathing was shallow, its skin feverish. Panic, a cold, unwelcome guest, seized Elias. He had faced down grizzlies and blizzards, but this fragile, gasping life rendered him helpless. He knew nothing of fevered infants. Magda, however, moved with an instinct born of desperation. She brewed a potent tea from dried willow bark and a handful of precious herbs she had salvaged from her meager belongings, her hands working with a practiced urgency. She administered the bitter liquid spoonful by spoonful, murmuring soft words of encouragement to the tiny, struggling form. Elias watched, a silent sentinel, as Magda fought the unseen enemy. Her brow was furrowed with concentration, her lips moving in silent prayer. Hours passed, agonizingly slow, until finally the infant's fever broke, its breathing evening out into a fragile, rhythmic sigh. A wave of profound relief, sharper than any cold, washed over Elias. He had witnessed her skill, her unwavering will, her power to nurture and heal in a world that sought only to consume. The experience was a stark reminder that true strength often lay not in brute force, but in the quiet, insistent will to preserve life. He had brought his rifle and his axe to the mountain, but she had brought remedies and resilience. This woman, whom he had initially seen only as a burden, had proven herself to be an indispensable ally, a vital part of the fragile ecosystem they were forging together. But as the storm outside briefly calmed, a new sound, sharp and unexpected, echoed through the valley. The distant, ominous howl of a lone wolf, closer than it should be, a chilling promise of new dangers still lurking just beyond the safety of their small, fire-lit world. The wolf's howl, a raw, primeval sound, pierced the fragile peace within the cabin. It was not just a hunter's call, but a declaration, a challenge to the encroaching darkness of the long winter night. Elias's senses sharpened instantly. The cabin, for all its newfound warmth, felt suddenly vulnerable. He moved to the small window, peering out into the swirling snow, his eyes scanning the tree line. The tracks were fresh, too close to the cabin for comfort. A shiver, not of cold but of primal fear, traced its way down his spine. The mountain was testing them, and this time the threat was not merely cold or hunger, but a predator drawn by the scent of fresh life. He knew the wolves of these mountains. They were intelligent, cunning, and relentless when driven by hunger. This close to the cabin, They were a direct threat to the infants, a danger more immediate than any blizzard. Magda, seeing the tension in his rigid posture, understood without words. Her face, still pale from the scare of the fevered twin, now tightened with a new fear, a maternal instinct to protect her young. She clutched the babies tighter, her eyes wide as she looked at Elias, a silent question in their depths. He reached for his rifle, checking the priming, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of this new peril. The night wore on, a tense, silent vigil. The wind howled, mimicking the predatory calls outside. Elias stood by the door, his gaze fixed on the shadows, his ears straining for any sound beyond the storm. Magda kept the fire burning bright, its flickering light a small defiance against the overwhelming darkness. The children, sensing the tension, slept fitfully, their soft murmurs the only sound besides the crackling hearth. Then, a new sound, distinct from the wind, a soft scrape against the cabin wall, a snuffle and the unmistakable scent of wild animal. The wolf was close, perhaps testing the perimeter, its hunger a palpable presence. Elias knew brute force alone would not suffice. He was one man against the cunning of the pack. He needed a plan. Remembering how Magda had used the mountain's bounty to heal, he had an idea, a desperate gambit. He motioned for her to keep the fire roaring, to make noise, to sound strong, while he slipped out through a small, rarely used back entrance. He moved silently through the snow, a phantom in the storm, carrying a small bag of dried meat laced with a potent, bitter herb, known to deter rather than harm. It was a risky play, counting on the wolf's instinct to avoid sickness. He laid the bait in a wide circle around the cabin, then waited, rifle ready in the deep shadows of the pines. The standoff was agonizing. The wolf, or perhaps several, sniffed at the offering. A tense growl, a moment of hesitation, then a sharp bark of disgust. The bait was taken, but the bitter taste was clear. The pack, wary of anything that might bring weakness, retreated, their howls fading into the distance, a sound of frustration rather than defeat. Elias returned to the cabin, his face grim, his body weary. But the immediate threat had passed. Inside, Magda met his gaze, a profound relief washing over her. The silence now was different, no longer just absence, but a fragile peace. That night, as the fire crackled and the children slept soundly, the emotional dam between them broke. The raw tension of the past hours, the shared ordeal, had forged an invisible bond. In the quiet intimacy of the firelight, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, they finally spoke of their pasts, not in accusations or regrets, but in shared understanding. Elias, his voice a low rumble, confessed the gnawing pain of his lost family, the guilt that had driven him to these solitary peaks. He spoke of his wife, of his child, of the fever that had swept them away, leaving him a hollow man. Magda, her voice soft and trembling, spoke of her own abandonment, of the town's cruelty, of the man who had forsaken her, leaving her with the twins and a future as bleak as the winter landscape. She spoke of her desperate flight, of believing she was leading her children to their deaths, only to find an unexpected, reluctant guardian in him. Their truths, raw and vulnerable, were not a shocking external secret, but the profound revelation of their shared brokenness, sealing their partnership as two outcasts who had, against all odds, found a strange solace in one another. As the embers glowed, a new, unspoken promise hung in the air, a tacit agreement to build a future, however uncertain, together. With the dawn came a new, fragile quietude. The wolf threat had receded for now, replaced by the profound intimacy of shared vulnerability. The confessions whispered by the firelight had stripped away the layers of solitude and fear, leaving behind a raw human connection. Elias no longer saw Magda and the twins merely as a burden, but as a living, breathing testament to resilience, a flicker of life in his world of shadows. Magda, in turn, saw past the mountain man's hardened exterior, recognizing the deep currents of grief and unspoken love that still coursed beneath. The cabin, once a symbol of his escape, now felt like a cradle, a place where new life was tentatively taking root. The routine settled into a comfortable rhythm. Elias continued to hunt and fortify, his actions now imbued with a purpose beyond mere survival, a fierce protective instinct for the small family he had unknowingly adopted. Magda, with her quiet determination, transformed the cabin into a true home. She gathered late-season berries, dried herbs, and kept the fire perpetually stoked. She hummed ancient lullabies to the twins, her voice a soft, melodious counterpoint to the howling winds, and Elias often found himself lingering near the hearth, listening, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the flames. They worked in unspoken harmony, two souls scarred by loss, finding an unexpected balm in each other's presence. One crisp afternoon, as Magda sorted through a small collection of dried herbs, a faded, intricately carved wooden bird fell from her satchel. It was a common mountain motif, a soaring eagle, but there was something unique about its carving, a particular swirl in the wing that caught Elias's eye. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern. He had seen this before, in a forgotten box from his own childhood, a small wooden animal carved by his father, a trapper who had ventured deep into these very mountains, bore the same distinctive mark. The revelation was subtle, a whisper from the past. It suggested that their paths, though separated by years and miles, might have been intertwined long before this cabin, through ancestors who shared not just a love for the mountains, but a specific, almost familial craftsmanship. The discovery was a profound one, hinting at a connection that transcended mere coincidence. It was as if the mountain itself, in its infinite wisdom, had guided them to this meeting, two broken souls destined to mend each other. The wooden bird, a tiny, silent messenger, spoke of an ancient lineage, a shared heritage with this wild land. Their bond deepened, cemented not just by shared hardship, but by the quiet understanding that their fates were perhaps always meant to converge here, in this secluded valley. They were not just two outcasts, but echoes of a forgotten kinship, brought together by the very mountains that had once taken so much from them. As winter began to loosen its icy grip, promising the first faint blush of spring, a sense of cautious hope bloomed in the small cabin. The children, thriving under Magda's care and Elias's protection, were growing stronger, their cries less fragile, their laughter beginning to fill the space. Elias, too, had shed some of his grief, finding a new kind of peace in the rhythm of their shared lives. He had not sought happiness, but it had found him, unexpected and profound. Magda had brought not just children, but a future, a reason to mend, a reason to fight. But the tranquility was short-lived. One evening, as the first stars pricked the indigo sky, a distant flickering light, a signal fire on a distant ridge caught Elias's attention. It was a specific pattern, one he knew from his past as a trapper, a warning. Someone was coming, someone who knew these mountains, someone with a clear purpose. The peace, so hard won, was about to be shattered. The distant signal fire, a malevolent spark against the vast expanse of the night sky, sent a chill through Elias far colder than any mountain wind. It was a language he understood, a message of impending intrusion, a deliberate intrusion into the sanctity of their newfound home. He watched it flicker, a silent sentinel of a past he had sought to escape, a past that now refused to remain buried. The peace they had painstakingly carved out of the wilderness was suddenly fragile, threatened by forces he had hoped never to confront again. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut, that the fire was a harbinger, a warning that their sanctuary had been discovered. Magda, sensing the sudden tension in Elias's posture, followed his gaze. Her eyes, wide with a renewed fear, fixed on the distant light. She had fled a judgmental town and a vengeful man, certain that the mountains offered the ultimate escape. Now, it seemed, her past had a longer reach than she could have ever imagined. The man who had forsaken her, the father of her children, was known for his relentless pursuit, his twisted sense of ownership. It was not just a threat to their safety, but a direct assault on the fragile family they had become. Elias, once a solitary figure, now felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. This woman, these children, they were no longer a burden, but his kin, his responsibility, and he would defend them with every fiber of his being. He spent the next days fortifying the cabin, his movements urgent and silent. He sharpened his axe, cleaned his rifle, and laid out his traps with a grim determination. He scouted the surrounding trails, searching for any sign of approach, any disturbance in the snow. He taught Magda how to load the rifle, where to aim, how to stay hidden. There was no room for sentimentality, only survival. He explained the mountain's harsh lessons, preparing her for a battle she had never imagined. The fear in her eyes was palpable, but so too was a fierce resolve. She was no longer just a frightened refugee. She was a mother, a defender of her young. The blizzard arrived with a vengeance, a white curtain descending upon the mountains, isolating them further. Elias knew it was both a blessing and a curse. It would slow down any pursuers, but also trap them within the cabin, making escape impossible. Then, through the howling wind, he heard it, the faint, muffled sound of voices, growing closer, battling against the storm. They had come. Not just the one man, but several, their presence a menacing intrusion into the pristine wilderness. Elias realized with a jolt that the man Magda had fled was not acting alone. He had brought hired men, perhaps bounty hunters, their greed fueling their relentless pursuit through the unforgiving terrain. The threat was larger, more organized, and more dangerous than he had anticipated. As the shadowy figures emerged through the swirling snow, their forms distorted by the blizzard, Elias knew they were after Magda, after the children. They saw her as property, a prize to be reclaimed, and the children as a mark of shame. He stood firm, rifle raised, a formidable sentinel guarding his makeshift family, but he knew a direct confrontation would be bloody, perhaps fatal for Magda and the twins. He looked at Magda, her face etched with despair, then at the sleeping infants. A choice, stark and agonizing, presented itself. To save his new family, to buy them time, he had to make a sacrifice. With a heavy heart, Elias lowered his rifle, a silent, desperate signal. He would offer himself, a diversion, a shield, to draw the aggressors away, to give Magda and the children a chance to escape into the unforgiving white expanse, placing himself in mortal danger for the lives he had so reluctantly come to cherish. The storm raged, a swirling vortex of white, as Elias stepped out of the cabin, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The figures, indistinct through the blizzard, halted, their rifles raising in unison. The leader, a man whose face was a cruel mask of cold determination, advanced, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Elias, a legendary trapper of these parts, now a solitary, formidable mountain man. This was Magda's pursuer, the man who claimed ownership over her, his greed twisted by a wounded pride. He had brought 2 ruthless trackers, men known for their brutality, their faces scarred by the harsh life of the frontier. They had expected a desperate woman, not a guardian of this caliber. Elias's calculated move was a gamble, a desperate attempt to buy time. He offered himself as bait, his surrender a silent signal to Magda to take the children and flee into the blinding snow. He had shown her a hidden path, a treacherous route through the blizzard-choked pines, knowing it was their only chance. As the leader barked orders, his men moved to bind Elias, their faces grim. But the mountain man, though seemingly compliant, was far from defeated. He had spent a lifetime observing the land, understanding its hidden dangers, and he had a plan, one that relied on the very unforgiving nature of the mountains themselves. The confrontation moved away from the cabin, towards a narrow, ice-slicked ridge known to Elias, a place where the wind howled with a particular fury. He allowed himself to be led, feigning a weary resignation, but his eyes constantly scanned the terrain, noting every treacherous patch of ice, every snow-covered crevice. He knew this ground intimately, every dip and rise, every loose rock. He saw the impatience in the eyes of his captors, their desire to quickly secure their prize and retreat from the blizzard. As they reached the most perilous part of the ridge, a sudden, Blinding gust of wind swept down, a natural ally in his desperate ploy. In that critical moment, Elias acted. With a powerful, unexpected surge, he threw his weight against the leader, not to fight, but to send him stumbling towards the precarious edge. He was not seeking to kill, but to disorient, to use the mountain's own force against his oppressors. The leader, caught off guard, cried out as he lost his footing, sliding precariously close to the precipice. The two trackers, momentarily distracted by their leader's peril, hesitated, their attention split. It was all Elias needed. With a guttural roar, he snapped his bindings, his immense strength fueled by the desperate need to protect. He didn't engage in a direct brawl. Instead, he used his knowledge of the terrain. He expertly kicked at hidden patches of ice, dislodged loose rocks, creating chaotic slides that sent the trackers scrambling, forcing them to fight the mountain itself. One tracker, caught in a small avalanche of snow and ice, plunged into a deep crevice, his desperate shouts quickly muffled by the swirling snow. The other, panicked, turned to flee, only to find himself disoriented by the whiteout, stumbling blindly into the deeper woods, his cries fading into the storm. The leader, bruised and shaken, clung desperately to a rocky outcrop, his face a mask of terror. Elias stood over him, a dark, imposing figure against the raging storm. He could have ended it there for all the pain and loss this man had caused. But a different kind of strength, one born of the new life he now protected, held him back. He chose not to strike, not to kill. Instead, he looked at the terrified man, his eyes cold and unwavering, and spoke in a voice that was both a promise and a threat. He made it clear that if this man ever returned, ever dared to threaten his family again, the mountain itself would finish what Elias had begun. The mountain man then vanished into the storm, leaving the leader clinging to his life, defeated not by brute force, but by the cunning and mercy of his unexpected adversary. Elias had won, not through death, but through a definitive demonstration that the true power of the mountain lay in its guardians, and that some victories were best served by the chilling wisdom of the wilderness. The blizzard finally broke, a slow, grudging retreat that left the mountain shimmering under a new, pristine blanket of snow. Elias, weary but triumphant, returned to the cabin. Magda and the twins were safe, huddled by the rekindled fire, their faces alight with relief and a profound gratitude that needed no words. The confrontation had been brutal, a testament to the harsh realities of their existence, but it had solidified their bond, transforming a reluctant alliance into an unbreakable family. The mountain had witnessed their trials, and, in its silent way, had blessed their union. 9 months later, the cabin was no longer just a shelter, but a vibrant, living home. Spring had painted the valleys with wildflowers, and the air hummed with the promise of new life. The laughter of the twins, no longer fragile, now echoed through the small space, a joyful symphony that had replaced the somber silence Elias once sought. He no longer carried the heavy shroud of grief. It had been lifted, replaced by the responsibilities and joys of fatherhood. Magda, her face radiant with a newfound peace, moved with a quiet grace, her hands skilled in nurturing their growing family. The man who had once fled from life now embraced it with a fierce, protective love. The cabin had transformed. Elias had added a small extension, a secure storage shed, and a sturdy fence to keep out curious creatures. Magda had cultivated a small patch of herbs and vegetables, a testament to her resilience and her ability to coax life from even the most stubborn soil. The scent of fresh bread often mingled with the aroma of pine and wood smoke, creating an inviting warmth that drew the few solitary trappers and prospectors who occasionally ventured into the high country. They found not a reclusive mountain man, but a family, a beacon of unexpected humanity in the wilderness. The children, growing strong and curious, would often chase the small mountain squirrels, their joyful shouts a stark contrast to the grim silence of Elias's past. One soft evening, as the last rays of sun painted the peaks in hues of gold and rose, Magda revealed a secret that had lain dormant within her. She pulled a worn, leather-bound journal from a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard. It belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had been a healer, a whispersmith of ancient mountain lore. The journal contained not only remedies, but also tales of her lineage, a family deeply intertwined with these very mountains, known for their uncanny ability to find safe havens, to build homes in the most desolate places. In its pages, Elias discovered that Magda's ancestors had been the very first to build the cabin, over a century ago, carving their legacy into the land. The carved wooden bird, he realized, was not just a shared motif, but an ancient family mark. This was not a chance meeting. It was a homecoming, a weaving together of two destinies that had always been meant to converge. The cabin, it turned out, had always been waiting for Magda's return. The revelation was profound, weaving a rich tapestry of history around their present. Their journey had not merely been one of survival, but of destiny fulfilled, of an ancient promise renewed. Elias, the man who had climbed the mountain to die, had, by saving the abandoned, found his true purpose, his true home. He had discovered that family was not solely forged by blood, but by the fierce bonds of protection, by the silent acts of love, and by the shared courage to face adversity. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitary despair, now stood as a testament to redemption, a place where two outcasts had built a sanctuary, where healing had replaced heartbreak, and where a new legacy, rooted deep in the heart of the mountains, had finally begun to blossom. The mountain, in its infinite wisdom, had not forsaken him. It had, in fact, led him home. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us from what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment. And to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.